So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the London Society webinar titled, What is the Future of High-Rise Housing? I'm Jo McCafferty, an architect and director at Levitt Bernstein, and I'll be your host for this evening. For those that are new to these webinars, many people may be familiar with them, but those that are new, the London Society is an organisation for everyone who loves London. And the aim of the Society is to translate and bring clarity to the complex issues that impact our built environments and ultimately the people who live and work in London. So tonight we are incredibly lucky to have two very eminent people practicing in housing with a huge amount of experience. So we have Andrew Beharrell and June Barnes, who are presenting their research and conclusions from their recently published book, which through a series of essays by different contributors examines the long-term social and financial impacts of residential towers. So there is no better moment to be talking about that right now. For those that don't know Andrew and June, I'm just going to briefly introduce them and then go through a little bit of housekeeping, and then it'll be over to them. So, first of all, Andrew Beharrell is an architect and senior advisor at Pollard, Thomas and Edwards Architects and a former director and senior partner there. Over his 35 years or more with the practice, he's designed and led many award-winning housing projects of all scales. And his work in urban design and master planning has also been fundamental to PTE's growth and its diversification as a practice. Andrew now lends his expertise to the practice's R&D group, which is known as the Knowledge Hub, and he sits on many design review panels himself and is also a regular industry commentator. He is an editor and a co-author of a series of very influential publications on housing, planning and regeneration, some of them with Levitt Bernstein. June Barnes has spent most of her career working in housing associations, and she retired in 2014 after 16 years as chief executive of East Thames Housing Group. No mean feat. Since then, until January 2021, she was a non-executive director of Urban and Civic, and she previously was vice chair of the National Housing Federation and chair of the Mayor's Sustainable Development Commission. She was also a board member of the Housing Forum and the Institute of Sustainability, and a member of the London Mayor's Design Advisory Group, alongside also being a trustee of the BRE, a very, very busy woman. She now sits on the Jersey Architecture Commission and a number of design review panels, including those in Cambridgeshire, Redbridge, and also for the LLDC. So hopefully that gives you a flavour for where Andrew and June may well be coming from this evening and what they might be presenting. Just to tell you a little bit about the structure of the evening, so there will be a presentation given by them both for about 40 minutes, and it will be followed by a discussion which I will prompt and then over to questions to the floor. So I'd be very grateful if everybody, as we go, start putting questions in the chat. Please don't put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat. And I will prompt those as the answers to those at the end of the presentation. We are aiming to finish by about 7:30, so we'll keep our eyes on time. Okay, well, hopefully that gives you a flavour of what's ahead, but we hope for a very vibrant and interesting discussion this evening. And so with that, I think I should hand over to you, June.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Do you want to put the next slide up, Andrew?
And the next.
And the next. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the book and how we've got to where we've got to, and also give you some context around the current development of high-rise housing in London and elsewhere. The essays really grew out of concerns that Dickon Robinson and I had, or more than 8 years ago. Dickon and I had both worked in housing associations on the development side and doing other things. And we were both really quite worried about the radical shift in London, which is where we'd mainly worked, in terms of building both high density blocks of flats and which were becoming increasingly tall, and how there were a range of issues about both the way we were building, but also the way they were owned and managed, which we continue to think are really very serious. And we hope by the end of this evening you'll kind of understand our concerns. I mean, we have an experience in this country of building high density flats and high rise flats when we really built a lot of council housing in the 60s and 70s. Most of the so-called tall blocks were only about 20 stories high, and we're now building much higher than that. And a lot of that failed, partly because it was very poorly built, partly because it was poorly maintained, and also because its residents didn't much like it. Not, that's, some people did, but it didn't suit a lot of people. And we spent an awful lot of our government housing budget in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s dealing with what was really a housing disaster. So we demolished and rebuilt, or we refurbished, but it was expensive. But the advantage that we had was that most of that housing was in one ownership, with a few people who'd taken up right to buy. So it was, when we were clear that there was a significant problem, we had a way of dealing with it, albeit very expensively. What we're doing now is significantly different. Most of what we're building is being developed by the private sector and is for sale. So it's sold to leaseholders, some of whom then live in their property, some of whom let it out, and quite a lot of whom are not resident in the UK. And then there are a few flats that might go through a housing association for shared ownership, and some, and this is increasing, for rent for people on low incomes. So if you can imagine a tall block with 100 homes, and actually that's 10 flats on a 10-story block, or a bit. So it's at the small end, and some have many more homes in them. There are likely to be a real mixture of people living this, and that adds complexity in terms of sorting out how you manage it. At the beginning of this process, the developers and contractors building high rise, and this really started to kick off in the early 2000s and has picked up steam, and Andrew will talk a bit more about that, didn't have enormous experience of building at height, and were also building for a price point. So initially, quite a lot of the high-rise housing was in inner London, and actually was in areas that were much sought after. But over time, the development has really started to concentrate in outer London, partly supported by the government's Help to Buy scheme, which meant that quite a lot of people on moderate incomes were encouraged into buying a property. Once the developers have developed the block and sold the block, the pattern has been to sell it, pass it on to somebody else. Initially, this was attractive because people pay ground rents. That's now changed. And the current model is that it gets sold, the freehold gets sold to a resident management company that the developer sets up, and which is jointly owned by all the leaseholders. And they in turn employ managing agents. So it's the responsibility of the managing agents and the leasehold management body, or the resident management body, to manage the blocks, decide what the service charges should be, decide what sinking funds are required, and taking a view about how they're going to be able to maintain the property over time. And so when they're faced with major works, it's sometimes difficult to get agreement, and even if you get agreement, it's difficult to get everybody to pay. And this has been thrown into sharp relief by the experience post-Grenfell, where we've had to remove cladding from buildings, and people have been faced with very significant bills. And even where the government has stepped in to provide money to renew the cladding, when the cladding's been stripped off, there have been all sorts of other issues that have been revealed, which the government aren't paying for, but which the leaseholders have to, if the buildings are going to remain in good repair. So Dickens and our major concerns were about the issue about whether service charges were being charged at the right level, and that includes sinking funds. And there was strong evidence, anecdotal evidence, that people were moving in at one service charge level, and relatively quickly it was doubling and more. And so people who moved in who were on a limited budget were starting to feel the pinch. And of course, the cladding issue has really harmed some people financially. Our second concern was about how fit the housing was in terms of its long term. Was it going to be housing that is going to be still standing in 100 years? And how are we going to manage if it wasn't? And we were particularly interested in, well, what if this is what we've got, and if this is going to be a significant way of providing housing in London and elsewhere, what can we do to improve both the position of leaseholders and the resilience of the buildings? And Dickon and I initially felt that there was a strong case for research, and we went and talked to a whole load of people involved in the development, construction, and management of these new homes. And it was quite fascinating having conversations with people who often recognized the very issues that we were talking about, but quite often also felt very conflicted about actually putting their head above the parapet, taking part in any research, because their income streams in part relied on the work that they were doing. So, however, in the course of chatting to people, we talked to Kath Scanlon at the LSE and to Andrew, who were both keen to help. And Kath had been doing research on high density housing for the GLA, and she had concerns about the research base, which we'll talk about later on. And Andrew had some specific and very interesting concerns around open space. And again, we're going to cover that later on. So with Kath and Andrew, Dickon and I had kind of formed a group, and with Andrew's suggestion, decided that rather than try to do detailed research, which would be expensive, that we would try to pull together a set of essays from people who we thought had useful things to say about the subject. And that's why you've got the book of essays. And Andrew, I'm going to pass over to Andrew, who's going to talk a bit more about this.
Thanks, June. I think the only thing I'd like to add to that is to stress that this book is not a sort of anti-tower polemic, far from it. And the many contributors to it range from tower skeptics to tower lovers or tower promoters, and every shade in between. But what we all agree about is that we have concerns about the long-term impacts of high-rise housing, and that if we're going to continue to build tall, we need to do it better as an industry. And although we do make specific recommendations, and June's going to summarize some of those at the end of the talk, a repeat theme is that we actually need much better research and data collection. So we see this book, which was put together with quite limited resources, as a start of the process, not an end to it. And we need help from the GLA and the boroughs and anyone else who cares to take on the mantle of perhaps pursuing the many threads that we've exposed perhaps in this work. I think the other general thing, a couple of things actually. Firstly, that we were all keen to focus on the practical aspects of building tall, and ideally things that lend themselves to some degree of measurability. So this book is not about townscape or skyline or aesthetics. A lot's been said and continues to be said on those subjects, and we're not going there because of the degree of subjectivity in that debate. And the other thing is that although this book is called What's the Future of High-Rise Housing, a lot of what we have to say applies also to some degree to dense mid-rise housing, or mid-rise development. But the point that we'll be making is that the issues are especially acute when you come to what we might call super dense tall developments. So Next, I'm just going to tell you what's in the book. If you haven't already, you can download it for free on the website link is in the London Society joining instructions to this, and we'll come back to it at the end. In brief, there are 8 chapters or sections, and we're going to talk about, or at least touch on most of that, not all tonight. I'm going to say a little bit more about the context in a moment. June has already opened that. June's going to talk in more detail about the costs to residents, particularly to leaseholders through service charges. The book contains a briefing on the current regulatory framework around leasehold by Douglas Rhodes from Trowers and Hamleys. We're not going to cover that tonight. It also contains an interesting section by David Salvi of Hereford Salvi Carr Estate Agents on the market for high-rise housing, and I am going to attempt a short summary of some of the issues from that. We have a chapter about design, construction, and maintenance, written by a combination of the 3 architectural practices which contributed and sponsored the publication. That's my own practice, Pollard Thomas Edwards, Alison Morrison, and Levitt Bernstein. And then, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'm going to hand back to June, who's going to talk about wider issues of well-being in high-rise housing, and an interesting survey that the LSE carried out for this book, the results of that. And then I'm going to talk about my particular interest in the relationship between high-rise housing and public open space as an example of the social impacts of very high density development. And then finally, I'm going to have to be a bit quick around some of this. June is going to summarize a few of our key conclusions and recommendations. So a bit more about the context. Firstly, what is high-rise housing? This is a fiendishly confusing and complex subject, and unfortunately I don't have time to talk about this all evening, and I won't. There is a whole section in the book, a little mini explanation. But briefly, these are the key points. Firstly, for the purpose of this book, we regard high-rise housing as anything over 30 meters, which is typically 10 residential stories or 9 residential over some other use at ground level. And that 30 meters was for many years the GLA's benchmark. I think it's still the call-in benchmark for planning applications. But to confuse matters, the purpose of building regulations, a lot of regulations refer to 18 meters, and you've heard a lot about this in the press. 18 meters is more like 6 stories, 7 at a real squeeze. And interestingly, that's kind of the height of traditional London mansion blocks. As many of you will know, the current 2021 edition of the London Plan switched from a 30-meter benchmark to a let the boroughs decide set of benchmarks based on local context analysis with a minimum threshold of 6 stories, so roughly 18 meters. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the boroughs are now carrying out, or have done in many cases, characterization studies to say what constitutes a tall building in a particular location. At the other end of the scale, we'll be referring to, as we do in several places in the book, to the London Tall Buildings Survey. Here's the latest one. Oh, it's very reflective, you can't really see that. Published by New London Architecture. Now that takes a height of 20 stories as its starting point. So those are really tall towers. So we will be referring in places to that kind of super dense tall tower. But as I say, our benchmark is anything above 10 stories. A bit more about context. I think June's already covered the legacy of post-war council housing. And indeed, our careers really started with the regeneration of post-war council estates, which included tall buildings, but were not exclusively tall. And in many cases, the wasteful demolition of those failed estates. Really wasn't much in London above that 30-metre benchmark built between the end of the 70s, early 80s, the last of those estates. You get a little bit coming in towards the beginning of the new millennium, but really things hotted up considerably from around 2010. And that's the period that the earliest NLA high-rise surveys cover. London Society particularly wanted us to touch on Grenfell. I'm going to say a little bit about that later on, but the concerns that we are exploring go beyond Grenfell, and indeed our involvement with them predates the Grenfell tragedy. Nevertheless, there's some very interesting things that, of course, that have come out of that. Why high rise? Why has there been this enormous increase in tall buildings in London? Well, the obvious and oft-given answer is to meet London's housing need, reflected in increasing housing targets propagated by government and GLA and filtered down to the boroughs. And that happening in the context of a very restricted land supply in London, with virtually no give in the Green Belt. I dare say we'll come back to the Green Belt in questions. It's a subject that I know London Society members feel passionately about, but obviously that's a big constraint on land. Simultaneously, we've used up a lot of the post-industrial land that was available for housing and regeneration, and indeed some think that it's gone too far and there's a lack of land for commercial development. Other sources of housing supply, such as estate regeneration, have become much more difficult and much more controversial for a whole series of reasons that belong to a different talk from this one, I think. So the kind of mantra has become build dense, build high around what planners call transport nodes, or existing town centres that have reasonably decent public transport, in particular a station. And that pressure to build around transport nodes is spread out from inner London very much to outer London, as I think many of you will be acutely aware. I'll say a bit more about who are high-rise flats for when I try to summarise David Salve's work. But on how much do they actually contribute to local housing need? Again, using the NLA survey, which I stress deals with tall towers, 20 stories and above, we now have 10 years of really useful data. Thank you, NLA, and thank you the various organisations which have sponsored and contributed to that work. We did a little bit of analysis of that 10-year data with help from Knight Frank. And to cut a long story short, our conclusion was that when you get away from these very high headline, so-called pipeline figures, and actually look at completions over that 10-year period, those tall towers have probably contributed a bit less than 5% towards London's annual housing target, which currently sits at 52,000 a year. But we have no equivalent figures for the probably much more prolific range of buildings in that 10 to 20 story range. There's a big gap in the collective evidence which we need to make sensible decisions about London's future. Right, so a little bit more on the NLA survey. Now, we used the 2022 survey. That was the latest available to us when we wrote the book, but I'll explain why the 2023 is in some ways less useful for this purpose, in some ways maybe more useful in the future. But many of you will know that these successive surveys have highlighted enormously high headline figures in 2022, 551 residential towers in London's so-called pipeline. That equates to about 88,000 flats. If you think about a typical tower with maybe 160 flats. That could be 300 to 500 people in a single building. And if you get a cluster of those, as we do in many places in London, particularly in those district centres, you could have a population increase of a rapid increase of 5,000 or more. Now, this is important when we think about the impacts of that number of people on a place, which can be very positive in terms of more customers to support existing and generate new local services, but it can also be a problem where it puts an intolerable burden on services. The latest 2023 survey uses they've changed the form of analysis. It's much narrower. It concentrates only on projects in the planning system, so either submitted for planning or having a planning decision in the year. So then we're looking at a number that's probably a bit closer to actual completions of about 20,000 homes, but some of those would have actually been refused planning, so it'll be a smaller number than that. Interestingly, they come out with an average height of 26 stories, and it also continues the trend that we've seen over successive years of there being originally a big concentration of high-rise in inner London, and then a growing number in outer London, and that trend continues, where we'll probably reach probably 50-50 balance quite soon. I mentioned David Salvi's essay, so I'm really trying to summarize his views as someone at the sharp end of advising the developers of market housing and of selling flats and renting flats on the private market. So who's suited to the high life? I think one thing we need to emphasize is that we know lots of people really like those who choose to enjoy living in tall buildings. We have more concerns about those who may not have had much choice or any choice. That's affordable housing tenants, but also more importantly about what more relevant to this work, about those who may have bought into high-rise living without fully understanding the consequences of that. And June will say more about it. According to David, the market is moving much more towards renters and away from buyers. We all know there are many international investors, particularly in central London, but there's a dismaying lack of true evidence about that. May I stress, international investments are a really good thing, but what we mustn't do is to confuse that with contributing to local London housing demand, unless, of course, those flats pass back through the rental system, in private rental system. According to David, this won't surprise you, the vast majority of those opting for the high life are single people and couples, particularly those in a wide range of professions, and also students, either sharing or wealth, or the students of wealthy parents, including international investors who buy for their children. He says actually relatively very few families choose to live in high rise, but there are exceptions, and the Barbican is one of those, which has quite a community of families. And he believes there's an untapped market, a potential growth market in high rise living for retirees. And a couple of other points before I hand back to June. He asked the question, are high-rise flats a good investment? He points out that typically you always pay more for a new home than a second-hand home. There's a new home's premium. You also pay more the higher you go, the higher floor you're on, because of the views that you get from that. But interestingly, he says that in the period 2014 to 2022, which was as far as our research went, it's a quite long period, typically the price you would get reselling the flat you bought new would be less than the original price. So there's been actually negative growth in the value of high-rise homes in that period. That's not to say that they're a poor long-term investment, but they have been a poor investment in that medium term. This may not matter to wealthier buyers who see them as a place to live and or a place to park investment. And the final point he makes, and then this leads into what June's going to talk more about, is that the service charges on tall buildings are inevitably, because of the complexity of the buildings and also the range of services that are often offered, considerably more than simpler low-rise buildings, often double that. And he has a number of examples of that. So on that note about the costs to the resident, I'm going to hand back to June. Mindful also of the time, June, I think we're going to have to canter a bit. Yeah, all of us. Here we go.
Okay, so I've said that Dickon and I were very concerned about service charges, and this is partly from our own experience. There isn't regulation around service charges in the private sector or in the public sector, and there is the government points to formal good practice, which is produced by the RICS on an intermittent basis, which suggests ways you should set service charges. In fact, social housing providers, councils and housing associations are exempt from that. And from research that we did when I was at East Thames, it became abundantly clear that people were setting service charges in all manner of ways. Lots of people who have been moving into high-rise housing, particularly in outer London more recently, are people on modest and moderate incomes. So, and this is typically first-time buyers, often with the Help to Buy scheme, which no longer exists, which provided a sort of soft top-up loan for a 5-year period to people on more moderate incomes, buying a flat that was less than 600,000. So those people were stretching themselves to buy their first home and have landed up in a situation where they've budgeted and then service charges and sinking funds have been higher than expected. And for some poor souls, and rather a lot of them, you've now got the issues associated with cladding. Also, there are a group of shared owners who've gone into high-rise housing as their first purchase, and they are even more likely to be hit because they've gone in there on a basis of buying a bit, renting a bit, but they still have responsibility for paying service charges. And what we found is that particularly on new developments, a lot of developers have a panel of solicitors stroke conveyancers that they've selected. So people have been using those solicitors, and the solicitors stroke conveyancers are not required to give as full information as we think they should do about both the obligations and rights that would-be leaseholders have. So if you pass on, Andrew. Next slide, yeah. So we've got a range of recommendations around this. First of all, we think that developers should prepare a detailed life cycle plan so that when somebody's buying a property, they should be able to see what the likely costs of owning that property are going to be over time, based on an analysis of when things are going to need repaired and replaced, you know, over a period of maybe 60 years or more. And we think that should be required by government. It should be a regulation. It should be part of what people submit when they apply for planning, as well as being provided to the purchasers, and also should be provided to the freeholders, who actually, as I've already said, could be resident management companies, and then be regularly updated, so that when you're buying as a leaseholder a flat, you're getting very good information about the likely long-term costs that you're taking on. And we also think that the legal profession should improve their advice to purchasers so that there's some sort of agreement about what they should get, and how they would understand rights and obligations. And we think that could be kite marked so people would know whether they were getting good advice or not. Next one, Andrew. Kath did two things, and you'll see this in the essays. first of all, she had a look back at what research there is around about the experience of living in high-rise housing. And a lot of that comes from, in the UK, comes from the experience of social housing towers. Elsewhere, there's quite a lot from America and some from Australia, but not a lot of it's not very recent. And you can see the sorts of things that people like. And as Andrew said, this is not, carping about high-rise blocks. Some people find them very, very satisfactory ways of living. But there are things people don't like. And what we don't know, as we've embarked on building rather a lot of this, is whether it's working, whether people are enjoying this. So next slide, Andrew. So Kath led on a survey, and this is not in any way something that the data can be relied on. It is a survey that they passed out to people that they've got links with, which also some firms of architects passed out as well, and various other people who we knew had an interest in this. And of the people that responded, and they were people who were more likely to, have a reason for responding, we had 50, mostly lived in London, mostly but not all in high rise, quite a few in high density. And you can see there the range of service charges that people were paying. And you can see it's quite a stretch. But there was one common theme, which was people were very unhappy about scheme management. And I think, and this also came out of David Salvi's work, that people often identify the manager as being the reason why things are expensive, rather than thinking beyond that to the actual building itself. And if we go on to the next slide, these are the major issues that came out. So you can see that fire safety is the biggest one, which is unsurprising because this is a post-Grenfell survey and people were having cladding taken off their buildings. But it's interesting that people mainly saw this as interim housing. They were going to live there, and in 5 years' time, they'd be living in a house. And the information that David Salvi has given about values actually dropping, rather than it being somewhere where you could save and therefore have a bigger deposit to move, is not borne out by the facts. And this has been further, it's been made worse by the cladding issue. And some people aren't in a position where they can even hope to sell their flats because they're not, they wouldn't be capable of having a mortgage on. Next slide. So we've got two sets of recommendations. The research that Kath did, looking backwards, picked up on a lot of the concerns in this country about the suitability of high-rise housing for people on low incomes, particularly people that were renting and people with families. So we think that there are a few things that the government ought to be thinking very seriously about, and this is not just central government, but local government, the GLA. First of all, is it really sensible to encourage marginal homeowners into expensive housing and housing which is likely to become more expensive rather than less? Should grant be given for family housing on, in high-rise buildings? Is that really the right place for families to grow up, for children to grow up? And, really, should we be doing this sort of housing as affordable housing? Next slide. Andrew's already picked up the fact that we really think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done in terms of understanding what we're doing and whether we're doing it properly. So understanding satisfaction and whether there's a link between tenure, household type and income. And we think that build to rent might be quite a successful model compared with some of the others. Understanding what are the real costs of living in high rise and what are the likely costs going to be over time. And what can we do that would, in the way that we construct homes, which would reduce lifetime costs as well as carbon. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew.
Okay, so one of the main essays in our book is around design, construction, and also maintenance of apartment buildings, especially tall apartment buildings. And these are just a few of the key points that we make there. The first is that in order to meet higher technical standards, particularly around environmental performance and, of course, fire safety, all new homes, not just tall ones, have become increasingly complex and costly to build and to maintain. And if you think about it, traditional wall construction had just three types of material, really: brick, mortar, and plaster. The modern equivalent for an apartment block has about 20 different types of component, and I'll illustrate that in just a moment. But when we look at tall buildings, these issues are become especially concerning, especially complex and especially costly. And that's partly because it's very expensive to access things at height. Think about, as a result of the cladding crisis, all those scaffolded tall buildings in London today. Think about what that scaffolding and the access arrangements are costing. But also because there are higher performance requirements. The higher you go, it increases the demands on structure, on cladding, and particularly on the mechanical, electrical, environmental services. In our book, we illustrate these points. This is a section through a typical floor-wall junction in a modern apartment building, just showing how very complicated it is. All those gaskets and linings, sealants, and tapes, and if you're cladding the thing in brick, enormously complex support structures to hold the stuff up. And putting that in context, on the left, you're kind of that kind of three-component traditional wall construction. In the middle, what we were just showing you, what's generally happening now. And on the right, what is starting to happen among more sophisticated developers, particularly those who've perhaps come out of the commercial sector, which is, dare I say, technically more sophisticated in the residential sector, towards panelized systems, whole wall systems. And this is a good direction to be going in. So a type of construction which is designed, tested, constructed, installed, guaranteed, all under one entity, rather than the putting together of lots of different components from different sources and with different testing regimes and different planned lives. Alongside all that, other issues are around building regulations, the fact that they've evolved incrementally to meet modern challenges. They've not really been thought through afresh from first principles and have become layer upon layer of complexity and sometimes contradiction and often confusion. And we see a lot of that coming out of the consequences of the Grenfell inquiry. And if you look at the planned life and still less at the guarantees offered on the components in buildings, which are guarantees of seldom more than 30 years and often less than that, and you compare that to the length of leases that are being sold, 250, even 999-year leases, these buildings are going to require major refitting several times in their lifetime. The cost of that is seldom, if ever, factored into the initial service charge regime, as June has been mentioning, and will, we think, come as a shock to leaseholders, especially those on moderate incomes and especially those who bought through Help to Buy. Interestingly, that you get a different regime emerging in professional build-to-rent development, and we may perhaps cover that a bit more in questions. I'm actually not, I think I'm conscious of the time. There's so much to say about Grenfell. I was asked to include this for good reasons, but Grenfell is deliberately not a major focus of our book, although clearly it's there and influences a lot of what we have to say. But this is about trying to look not directly at what went wrong, but at what we've learned from that, or what we should have learned from it, what we will, I hope, be doing in the future. Very happy to come back to that, Joe, in questions, but I'm going to move on now. And I'm going to move on to just briefly summarize the final essay in our book, which is around the relationship between tall buildings and public open space. So shared and public open space. So what we're looking at here is open space as an example of the wider social and environmental impacts of very dense development. Now, most of us claim to value open space, and we have all sorts of planning policies to protect it and enhance it and to prevent degrading it and overburdening it. But what our study shows is that there is widely differing provision of open space in super dense developments. It ranges from the generous to the non-existent. And that, I think, begs some really important questions about how much we really value open space and whether related planning policies are being relegated in order to achieve housing growth targets. And it may be that delivering more homes justifies a reduction in access to open space, or it may be that we need to rethink our approach to high-rise housing. But in any event, we need better evidence on which to base such decisions, and we need to be more transparent about what's going on. The architects in this session will know that the original concept of tall residential towers, probably most famously promulgated by Le Corbusier and La Ville Radieuse, was about buildings sitting in parkland. So towers were to be surrounded by green open space, which also flowed beneath the buildings. And by building tall, the built footprint is reduced, the ground plane is liberated, in the jargon, and everyone enjoys views of and access to the landscape. And this was the vision taken up by the architects and planners of Britain's post-war reconstruction. But it is a vision that in many cases is sadly lacking today. And just to park that thought and cast your minds back to the pandemic, something we hope we'll never see again, was the closure of some London parks because they were too popular, because too many people wanted to use them. So whilst we hope that particular reason won't recur, it does remind us that our parks cannot sustain limitless increases in the intensity of use, and some can get just as crowded on any hot July weekend. So how much open space has London already got? Well, actually, London has lots of open space. We're starting in a good place. I'm not going to go through these figures now, they're all in the book, but it translates into a very high average amount of open space per person. You'd have thought plenty to sustain our projected 10 million population in 2031. But when you look at how it's distributed, you get a very different picture, which varies from Islington, where there is around 8 square meters per person of open space, to Bromley with 259 square meters per person. And Tower Hamlets, which is the borough with the greatest number of tall buildings, as laid out in the NLA survey, has around a relatively low figure of 17 square meters per person. And there are studies which also show, we haven't done a new study, this is publicly available information, a correlation between London's poorest boroughs and open space, which you can see in this chart here. Furthermore, many of our residential growth areas, and therefore many of our tall buildings, tend to be located in former industrial areas, which in turn coincide with areas of open space deficit. How much open space does London need? So, as I mentioned, we've got lots of planning policies, starting with the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, the London Plan, and the local plans of every borough, which declare that every citizen should have ready access to green open space. But there's no London Plan target or formula to ensure a minimum amount of open space to be provided alongside every new housing development, or to be found from existing local capacity. There are numerical formulas for play space and private open space, but not the overall amount of shared and public open space. Some boroughs, notably Camden, have introduced their own targets, and it would be very interesting to see how that plays out. If we go back to Patrick Abercrombie, the father of the London Plan, a bit of a hero for the London Society, he recognised the same open space deficit in the inner London working class boroughs, and he had some specific ideas to remedy it. He thought there should be a minimum 4 acres per 1,000 people, that's 16 square metres per person, roughly, within half a mile walk from everybody's home. And we've taken that as a kind of interesting benchmark. What we then did, amongst other things, and I'm rushing now, there's much more information in our book, is to look at just 4 of the biggest regeneration schemes in London involving tall buildings. And you can see from these bold figures, and I say there's a lot more detail in our methodology in the book, that it varies hugely from the poster child, the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park with a extremely generous 18 square meters per person, down to virtually nothing in North Acton. Now, I should say that the Development Corporation is belatedly trying to mitigate what's happening in North Acton, and it will improve over time. But that is where we are at the moment. And we've also looked at what we call standalone or towers that occupy effectively the whole footprint of a site, and using, again, NLA data, which I don't have time to go into now, but it's in the book, conclude there are many, many standalone towers being given planning permission and consequently constructed in London, which provide effectively no public open space at all, but rely on whatever might be existing locally. At street level, that is. So to conclude this bit, I think that this open space study is really a starting point. We're calling for more comprehensive and continuing research to help inform decisions about London's future character and built form, including whether there is a case for a minimum target amount of nearby public open space for every additional resident and possibly every additional worker. That, again, I mentioned Camden is actually doing this. That would be a kind of stealth cap on density, effectively, but through a practical intent. And I think the last point, and I'll hand back to Jude, is we do have a choice about whether and where to continue building tall. It's not an inevitability, and a choice about how to meet the growing challenges which that entails, including the provision of open space and the other challenges covered in this set of essays. So what we're pleading for is to make a more informed choice and through more transparent processes. And back to June, has the unenviable task of winding up and concluding.
And the answer is I'm not going to, because you're going to get these slides, I think, and we've only given you 4 minutes for questions, which is very unreasonable of us. So
I think we're allowed to overrun a little bit.
Over to you, Jo.
Thank you, June. Thank you, everybody who's been popping the questions through the Q&A as well. So I'll dive straight into those, but I thank you both for such an insightful session. I think we're going to have a part 2, aren't we? There's so much to talk about. First of all, just diving in, I think Henry Peterson, you were the first person to kind of dive in. You're currently working as a volunteer advisor to the Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum, and you're struggling with a kind of joined up conversation about the impact of tall buildings that through the Imperial College development of 7 buildings, including 3 towers over 50 stories. I think you haven't perhaps got so much as a question, just to say that you're really supporting the book and the contents of the book. I'm presuming those towers, Henry, are residential towers. perhaps you can put something in the Q&A shortly just to confirm that. But I think really you're just wanting this information to be disseminated in the broadest way. June and Andrew, do you want to say a little bit about the conversations that you're having kind of more broadly? You are trying to disseminate this. You're also trying to get support for research to progress all of these threads.
We've been presenting this to a whole range of people. We've had good conversations with GLA. We've got a conversation about to happen with the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. We're doing a presentation to the Old Oak Common team in October. We are talking to the British Property Federation tomorrow. We've talked to a variety of organisations, and there's been a lot of very positive feedback, but the difficulty is getting somebody to grasp the nettle and actually put some serious money into really doing some work, particularly around the proper regulation and what that would look like. Some work around really understanding what people are experiencing and the actual costs of high-rise housing in terms of management and maintenance, but also to do a review of building regulations, to try and erase this contradiction, to look at simpler ways of doing things, but which are very robust, and to align the building regulations with planning. So there's a lot to do. So if anybody who has listened today has got good contacts, would like us to come and talk to somebody, has got a few £1 million for research, then do please get in touch with us. We do see this as the start rather than the end. And I think in a period where we've just been talking about rack and building buildings for 30 years, our concern is that we're genuinely building buildings that are very complicated, that may not have the life that we really need them to have in London.
Thank you, June. I think everybody probably on this call shares that concern, and but yes, it's clearly the beginning of the conversation rather than the end. Ivana, you've asked a question, well, stated a point about one of the big constraints in terms of building in London has been the extremely large areas of the metropolis that are designated as conservation areas. It's a kind of interesting part of the discussion. As well as, you say, too many single family homes, so 18th and 19th century houses. It's certainly true, Andrew and June, that London is constrained in terms of building, and particularly if you're looking, Andrew, to change and to weave into the London plan this overall target for open space within denser development or within all residential development in London, that will be a further constraint, certainly. But do you want to come back to that point, either of you? Perhaps Andrew, you could take this one on.
Well, conservation areas are, of course, one of many constraints on development in London, one that I would not want to see removed. Although, interestingly, it's perhaps just worth remarking that, again, in the earlier part of my career and June's, that we worked together on this, we did a lot of conversion of street houses. And of course, you can, at that time, and you could convert a Georgian or Victorian street house from a single family dwelling into typically 3 very good quality flats and maisonettes. So you're tripling the density without any impact whatsoever on the street scene. But we've rather done all that now in London. We've used that up. And I think inevitably, and here the hackles will be rising among many London Society members, if we're serious about creating significantly more homes in order to meet the many demands for new homes and to keep control and to bring down the cost of them, we're going to have to consider Greenbelt review. There's just not enough brownfield land within London that is developable with ease to meet those numbers. And I think clearly, until now, when we're getting some hints from a potential Labour government of Greenbelt review, It's been completely off the political agenda. There's lots and lots of issues around it, which we won't have time for tonight. But I think the relevance to tonight's discussion is one of the things we're highlighting is that it's sort of become assumed, particularly with the removal of the density matrix that some of you may remember, that the density of development on a particular site that is well connected is kind of limitless. That the sky's the limit, and why not just go higher and higher and higher, which is what we're seeing at North Acton. And I think what we're questioning is whether that is true. And actually, we think that when you put together all of the different impacts, there are limits, and therefore we can't depend on limitless increases in density to compensate for the lack of land supply within a London that is strictly constrained by the Green Belt.
Andrew, thank you. That was a very deep and full response, and I would certainly agree with that. I think, Carol, that sort of folds into your question, which is suggesting actually back to those terraces, Andrew, that you and June worked on earlier on in your careers, the conversion into individual family homes, kind of converting into multi-family housing. I think the answer to that, Carol, is that there has been a huge amount of that that's been completed over the years, and actually what we're facing is something else that's not on its own going to solve the problem. I'm going to jump into some of these other questions. James Pargeter wanted a discussion about build to rent, which, Andrew, you did mention later on in your presentation. But James's point is about that they are purpose-built design buildings, and so therefore they're retained in overall single ownership with a single point of responsibility for safety and maintenance, and no service charge or other management charges, and also are tenure blind. So surely they might work for taller buildings. And I think you both went on to make that point, that actually it depends on tenure and ownership.
Yeah,
Yes,
we agree.
Great.
Yeah, I would just one little caveat, which is I don't know enough about, maybe someone else on the call does, about the long-term business plan of build to rent landlords. Clearly, they do have an interest, a commercial interest in the long-term management, and therefore they're looking more thoughtfully at the design and construction to minimize costs and to be able to renew things efficiently. But do their business plans extend for 250 years? Or is it for 25 years? Because the problems are going to start to manifest after about 25 years.
Andrew, I'm sure James would like to carry that conversation on with you afterwards. I know he had a huge amount of experience working for Greystar, so I'm sure he probably could answer that question. But perhaps that's part two or outside this conversation. There's a quick question here just about conflict of interest, which I think is interesting, from somebody who is unnamed in the chat. But perhaps, June, this might be something for you. Are you concerned about a conflict of interest for developers who provide long-term service charges at the point of sale? How could that be overcome? I suppose kind of asking for full information at that stage about the service charges, that I suppose that's the point that's being made.
Yeah, I think builders are already having to be developers provide more information to freeholders in by way of plans and documentation. I think what we're wanting them to do is to take that and start to look at what effectively a maintenance repair and replacement plan over probably a 60-year period, to look at what the likely costs would be of replacing components, repairing components, and this would in particular hopefully get developers to think about the way that they were building the building. And I mean, here the analogy with people who are doing build to rent is they have a very specific interest in making it very easy to, or much easier, not very easy, much easier to maintain properties and maintain services in those properties. So we're trying to effectively get the developers to think like that, which might mean that they have to work a bit harder at what they're producing to make them more acceptable for people to buy. But then that information is regularly updated by the freeholders, so that over time, when anybody moves in, they're getting a good sense of how much things are likely to cost based on existing experience and looking forward. We think it's appalling, frankly, that the biggest expenditure that most people make in their lives has no real guarantees attached to it. I know there are guarantees, but I think some of the Grenfell stuff has proved that it's not as easy to, or the cladding stuff has proved that sometimes it's not so easy to make those actually, for them to pay up. So I think we've got to try and kind of shift the burden of responsibility back to the builders and developers, and not just to the people that buy.
Jean, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting also sort of that having no information regarding your future costs, but also, as the agents section paper within the book describes, a decreasing value actually. So it's those two things running in parallel. We have overrun. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and I think we have to close, sadly. But I'm sure the London Society would like a part 2, maybe on future research, which hopefully will be undertaken and paid for after this session. Denise, you've asked a question which is related to what June has just said, which is around the kind of complex heating systems and their management long-term costs of the replacements of all the kit that goes in the buildings. It's not just obviously the cladding and the fabric of the building, but it's actually all the MEP that supports that. And she goes on to say, June, that she would advocate a full management plan to be submitted at planning stage, as you're describing, really, for approval, including month-by-month costs and heating costs.
Yes. Yeah, and these buildings are enormously complex, and buildings inevitably, you think component parts will fail. They're bound to. It's how easy it is to get to them, and knowing where they are. So there's lots of anecdotal stuff about people having leaks in flats in tall buildings, and it just being impossible to trace where the water is coming from. It could be several floors up, but how do you know? And how do you get to it if you do know? Because it's all hidden away.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to touch on the open space provision, Andrew. This brings you in a query here or a suggestion actually from Claire Armstrong. Should open space provision be regulated through planning like car parking spaces for new builds?
Well, as I've sort of touched on, and there's more in the essay, I mean, it is regulated through planning, in that there are many qualitative tests through the London plan, filtering down into local authority plans, as well as things like the greening factor and related things around biodiversity. What there isn't is an overarching quantity formula that every scheme shall provide this much shared and public open space per new resident or indeed new worker. That's different from, we do have quantitative requirements around play space, and we have them around private balconies, private open space, not around shared and public space. And that's the question we're raising. To have them would have quite a profound impact on the realizable density of development on a particular piece of land, unless you could demonstrate that, which you're meant to do today, but I think it seldom happens, that there is truly capacity in existing nearby open space to absorb an increased population.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, I think actually a lot of that policy that you've listed in the book and that you mentioned in the presentation, interestingly, also alongside those targets that you're mentioning, weaving that into the London plan, they do need review. I think things like children's play and space for young people, it feels how that's quantified and designated and controlled actually also needs rethinking. So perhaps that's something that we could also come back to in a part 2 or 3. I'm very aware there are lots of queries that have come through here about the green belt, comments about the green belt, but I think we'll have to fold that into a new session, but to be continued. But so with that, I think we should draw it to a close because it's almost 7:45. But a huge thank you to all of you who've dialed in this evening. It's been quite a long list of attendees. I do hope you feel we've covered the questions as much as we possibly could in the time. Certain people have been asking about where to get hold of the book. And as Andrew said, you can download it on the London Society webpage on the link. I think there's, yes, information there you can see, the www.highrisehousing.co.uk. And with that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Andrew and June for an extraordinary presentation. I do really hope that there is a part two. Please, people, spread this wide and loud, and I think get real support for these future areas of research work which are so needed. I do have to tell you about a few events coming up in the London Society in the next few weeks, just very quickly, and you can see them all on the website. There's one on the 3rd of October in person about social justice and health equity with Professor Michael Marmot. So please dial into that, because that sounds very, very interesting indeed. Or actually, I think that's, in person. So please look for tickets for that. There's one on the 23rd of October, which is an In Conversation with Dylan Jones, who is the editor-in-chief of the Evening Standard. And Leanne Tritton is chairing that, and there's going to be lots of discussions about the things he loves in London and how he feels media has shaped London. So that sounds interesting. And then finally, one on the 16th of November, an in-person session, which is all about public toilets. And with that, I'm going to close. But thank you so much this evening, and I think you should all go away and get a copy of the book. Thank you to Andrew and June and for the London Society for hosting, and have a very good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.